Elijah chipped the last bit of wood away, then ran his thumb over the pawn's head before holding it out to inspect. It wasn't perfect, but his whittling skills had improved since he'd first washed ashore. And using the knife he'd taken from the gnomish invader was much better than using the flint-bladed knife upon which he'd once relied. So at least the chess piece was recognizable. He set it down on the homemade board, where it joined all the others he'd carved. Finally, after 4 nights of work, he'd finished the set. Leaning back in the chair, he looked down at the small pile of wood shavings and sighed. It had been almost a week since he'd returned from the tower, and he'd spent much of that time in total relaxation. Sure, he still had to pick the incredibly nourishing berries from his garden, and he'd spent a little time fishing as well, but after spending the past few months in a struggle for survival, none of that seemed so onerous. But as he sat there, Elijah had to admit something to himself. He was devastatingly bored. At first, whittling his chessboard had been enough to stave off his boredom, and because of that, he'd stretched the process out quite a bit. However, now that he was finished, he couldn't help but wonder what he was supposed to do with all his free time. If he'd been back home in Hawaii, he might have gone out hiking. Or hung out with his friends and co-workers. Perhaps gone on a date with Lacey. Maybe he would have planted himself in front of his laptop and watched some trashy television, or the latest, greatest prestige drama. He could have gone to a football game. He could have played basketball. Or headed down to the gym to work out. The modern world was replete with near-infinite ways to waste time and relax, but stranded on his island, opportunities for recreation were slim. Which was why he'd long since taken to carving various bits of wood. Still, that could only occupy him for so long before he started to go a little crazy. The fact was that, with his basic needs met, and with the safety his home represented, boredom had truly begun to set in. Sighing, Elijah decided to do something he'd been putting off for some time. So he rose from his seat, which had been grown from the floor, and prepared for a little excursion. Or more accurately, a project that had been sitting in the back of his mind for months before he'd entered the tower. To put it simply, he wanted to make some soap. At the most basic level, he understood the process well enough. He needed to make some lye, then melt some fat, and add the two together. He'd even seen it done a few times when he was young. But vague memories were not enough to make him confident that he could do it. Still, he was willing to try. So the first thing he did after slipping on some shorts he'd cobbled together from the last remnants of the cloth he'd taken from the invaders was grab his equipment. Staff in one hand and the axe he'd taken from the dwarf in the other, he descended from his tree house and into the early morning air. It was cold, but judging from the lack of bite in the wind, winter was close to giving way to spring. His first task in his quest for soap was simple: find lots of wood. So, axe in hand, he set off into the forest and set about the arduous process of gathering fallen branches, which he dragged back to his old cabin. It was just as decrepit as always, but at least the smell of rotten crab had dissipated in the months since he'd last visited. Once there, he cleared an area, then once it was free of debris, he started piling his branches. It took most of the day to get enough, but by the time he'd finished, he had enough for a sizable bonfire. He lit it, then sat back to watch as the flames enveloped the meticulously stacked branches. Once that was done, he found a large tree whose trunk was nearly 2 feet across, then set about cutting it down. With his enhanced strength, Elijah was only held back by his tools. Luckily, the dwarven axe was well made, and the tree fell after only a couple of hours. By that point, night had begun to fall, so he retreated back to his tree house, where he spent the night whittling before going to sleep. The next morning, he returned to cut the fallen tree into 2 sections before rolling them next to the remains of the bonfire. Elijah added some additional branches, then started the process of turning the rounds of lumber into a pair of barrels, which, over the next few days, he accomplished by slowly chipping away at the interiors of both. It really wasn't so different from how he'd created his bowls, just on a much larger scale. In the end, it was an entire week before he was satisfied, and by that point, he'd managed to accumulate a huge pile of wood ash. So, after lining the bottom of the largest barrel with sticks, then layering some pine straw over top that, he started shoveling ash inside. Once the barrel was full, he took the smaller barrel, which he estimated would probably hold about 20 gallons of water, to the stream, where he filled it. Then, Elijah started pouring water into the larger barrel, stopping only when he'd created a soupy mess that he covered with a layer of sticks and moss. With that done, he dropped off his tools at his tree house, then shifted into a panther and went on the hunt. Given his awareness of everything on the island, locating his prey was laughably easy, and he quickly hunted down and killed a large boar. The only tricky part was avoiding its lethal tusks, but Elijah was experienced enough with hunting dangerous prey that he had no issues with that. Once the animal was dead, he shifted back into human form and dragged the 300-pound carcass back to the cabin, where he processed it. The meat and edible organs went back to the tree house's cold storage, but he had other plans for the layer of fat he took from the animal's back. After cutting it into chunks, he gathered the old pot he'd long ago found in the cabin, then started melting the fat down over a smaller fire he'd built. Once it had turned to liquid, he poured it through a piece of cloth again, taken from the clothing he'd looted from the invaders, and into one of his bowls. He repeated that process a couple of times until he had nothing but pure fat, which he left to cool and harden. With that done, his next task was to gather something to make the eventual product smell a bit better. For that, he harvested some pine oil before retiring for the night. The next day, he poked a hole in the bottom of his large barrel and drained the ash water into the smaller receptacle. The dark brown color looked right, but he needed to check if it was appropriately alkaline. To do that, he tasted it. Normally, he'd never have done that. That was a good way to get your tongue melted, but he had access to touch of nature, so he wasn't afraid of playing loose and fast with his own health. Fortunately for his tongue, it was only slightly alkaline. Unfortunately for his project, that meant he needed to repeat the process. So he filled the barrel, better categorized as a lye hopper, considering its use, with more ash, then poured the water back in. It took 3 more rounds over the next week to get it where he wanted, but by the time he'd finished, he was satisfied with the results. So, after straining it a couple of times, he boiled the resulting liquid into a more concentrated solution. Finally, he was ready to make his soap. The remaining process involved melting the fat, then adding the lye water before spending the next 3 hours stirring it. During that time, he added a bit of pine oil and a few pinches of salt he'd gotten by boiling seawater. Eventually, the mixture took on a pudding-like consistency, telling him that it was ready. Upon reaching that point, Elijah poured the white substance into a mold he'd whittled for that purpose and took it back to his tree house.
Hey everyone, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy the audiobooks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a Patreon member. As a member, you'll gain the ability to request the next part of a novel audiobook I've uploaded, depending on your Patreon tier.
After that, it was just a matter of waiting a few weeks until everything hardened. All in all, it had taken Elijah a week to finish the project. But now, he was back to having nothing to occupy his time. So, without anything else to focus on, he returned to his grove and, while flaring nature's bounty, circled through the garden. He was on his 3rd revolution when he noticed that the ancestral tree had subtly changed. Before, it had taken the appearance of a massive and ancient oak tree. It wasn't one, but that was how it had looked. But now, its brown-gray bark had begun to skew closer to white, and its leaves, which, given the season, the presence of which was more than a little incongruous, were distinctly lighter. In addition, the Ethera in the area felt noticeably thicker than before. He shook his head, knowing that the shard of the world tree was responsible. Was that the extent of the changes he could expect? Or was there more in store? There was no way to know, but Elijah couldn't help but wonder if he'd made a big mistake. In any case, after finishing his rounds, he set off to explore more of the island. He was aware of everything in his territory, which stretched across the whole island, but there was a distinct difference between that awareness and actually laying eyes on it. To Elijah, it felt like the difference between seeing photos of something and experiencing it. So, with that in mind, he began a thorough exploration of the territory he'd claimed. That occupied him for the next few days, though when he reached the cliff overlooking the tower, he got an incredible surprise. He could feel the seafloor. His domain only extended a few feet past the cliff, but it had definitively grown. Which, according to Nerthus, should not have been possible. So Elijah used Ancestral Circle to teleport back to his grove, then marched toward the ancestral tree to demand some answers. Nerthus responded to his calls with some alacrity, and when Elijah told him what was happening, the tree spirit said, "It must be the shard. The boundaries of your domain are no longer as fixed as they once were. Does this mean it'll keep growing forever?" "No. This planet is too large and the Ethera is too diffuse," Nerthus answered. "But with luck your territory will soon encompass the tower. If that happens, you will not need to conquer it again." "I don't understand," Elijah admitted. "The excess Ethera the tower is meant to contain will go to fueling your grove," Nerthus said. "It's not dissimilar from how the grove prevents the manifestation of other dimensional rifts." That was when Elijah realized that, since returning from the tower, he'd yet to see or feel any other Vox incursions. When he asked Nerthus about it, the tree spirit explained that his grove drained any dimensional disturbances of Ethera, keeping them from forming. "It won't completely disable the tower, but it will keep it from overflowing," Nerthus finished. "Assuming that your domain grows that large, of course." That was a weight off Elijah's shoulders. Even if he was a little bored, he'd been dreading going back into the tower. If it was necessary, he'd already decided he would do it, but now, it didn't seem like he'd have to. Not unless he wanted to. It was just a seed of a feeling, but Elijah had begun to move past some of the more horrible aspects of his time in the tower. He could acknowledge that they were terrible, but time had begun to heal those wounds and blur the memories. Instead, he'd started to focus on how much he had grown as well as the triumph he'd felt upon conquering it. "That is not uncommon," Nerthus said when Elijah had explained what he was feeling. "This universe is built on strength, and the most efficient way to progress is to challenge dimensional rifts and conquer towers." "I see," Elijah said. "What is to prevent me from conquering it again, then?" Indeed, if that was the best way to grow stronger, then it made sense to simply repeat the process over and over. "Diminishing returns," Nerthus said. "Doing so will not gain as much kill energy. Of course, you can still earn money, but..." "Money? I didn't get any money." "Of course not. Explain." Nerthus sighed. "The system rewards killing Vox more than anything else, and the same goes for killing creatures in the towers," he said. "Some of that reward comes via kill energy, which is just another form of Ethera, by the way, but the bulk of the reward is monetary. If you wish to collect your reward, you only need to go to a branch of the world tree, which will read your status, and give you your reward in the form of currency." And where do I find one of a branch of the world tree?" "Major population centers," said Nerthus. "Like the settlement across the strait. Perhaps, if they imported one. For natives, someone will have to first join the cult of the world tree as an envoy, which will grant a spell to grow a branch," Nerthus explained. "It really is exciting. Most people in the wider universe never get to see such a thing." "So you're saying that when I reach one of these branches, it'll be able to tell what I've killed, and they'll just give me a bunch of money," Elijah summarized. "Yes." "Well, that's good to know," he said. He had no idea how the system's monetary system had been implemented in the world at large, but he suspected that, as was always the case in any society, money would be incredibly important going forward. Not that it did him much good. He was still stuck on his island, and though he felt confident about crossing the strait, he certainly couldn't do so until his domain rendered the tower safe. So he really wasn't any better off than before. But on the bright side, at least he'd have some soap in a couple of weeks. Sarah Linissa looked around with wide eyes, her every footfall accompanied by fresh awe. The trees were so green, the local fauna so varied, it was so distinctly wild that she could not help but wonder if the curated forests of her homeland even qualified for the label. The Empire of Scale was one of the oldest in existence, and though there were plenty of untamed lands within its borders, the inhabited territory was so thoroughly controlled that it could scarcely even be called wild. Or that was true of any place Alyssa had been allowed to roam unsupervised. That was why she had begged her mother to allow her to visit the newly integrated world called Earth. If she was ever to realize her potential as a true dragon, she needed to experience a world without the protection and guidance of her ever-present chaperones. It had taken some time to convince her mother a powerful elder dragon in her own right, but in the end, her logic was unassailable. No one truly progressed beneath the shelter of a powerful wing. Instead, a hatchling had to experience the world for herself, lest she be unprepared for the challenges inherent in evolution. Earth represented a perfect opportunity. Even though Alyssa was barely more than a hatchling, she was still a member of an elder race. That meant that she was at the pinnacle of what could exist on a newly integrated world. Of the inhabitants of Earth, only truly mighty guardians could rival her power, and those posed no threat to her. Indeed, they would be more likely to assist than attack. No, she was in no real danger. Otherwise, her mother never would have allowed her to visit the planet. So the juvenile dragon was more than a little surprised when she caught an ephemeral whiff of something extremely interesting. Since coming to Earth, she had sensed plenty of spikes of Ethera. The world was still in flux, and as such, the ambient Ethera was unsettled. However, there was a distinct difference between wild Ethera and what she felt in the distance. It wasn't just powerful. It was enticing in a way she couldn't quite understand. As a result, Alyssa was moving before she had a chance to examine her curiosity. Her form was large, at least for the tiny world in which she found herself, but she moved through the forest with sinuous speed. A few local animals fled before her, and rightly so. While she was barely more than a hatchling on Earth, she was mighty, and the wildlife could sense that they were in the presence of an apex hunter. It reminded her of her youth, when she was little more than a clever lizard. That was decades ago, but she still remembered it with some degree of fondness. Back then, she had fought tooth and claw for every advantage. And through some twist of fate, she'd managed to survive. She had thrived, steadily growing in power and intelligence until, at last, sapience had bloomed. That was when her mother had found her. From then on, she had been coddled as she was ushered into juvenility. She had grown into a mighty, if young dragon. Still, Alyssa had a long way to go before she could truly claim her birthright, and when she did, she would need to be much, much stronger. Those thoughts and more slithered through her mind as she stalked through the forest. Every now and then, she came across particularly slow animals, which she used to satisfy her budding hunger. The furry, little creatures went down in a single gulp, reminding her of what she had left behind. They were not unpleasant, in fact, despite the gamey tinge to the meat, she enjoyed the little morsels. However, they were nothing compared to the feasts her mother's servants prepared on a daily basis. Gradually, she drew closer to the curious ethereal aroma, and with every step, it grew more potent until she could think of little else. In the back of her mind, Alyssa knew she should have maintained caution, but a combination of the overwhelmingly enticing smell, her natural curiosity, and the certitude in her own might pushed it aside. Still, she maintained her wits enough that, when she reached the source, she recognized it for the danger it represented. But by that point, she could not stop, and she ran headlong into the trap. Even as the ethereal bonds snapped around her, she fought against them, ripping them to pieces with her claws and teeth. If she was a little older, she might have won free. However, the trap had been well designed, and soon enough, she found herself pressed against the loamy forest floor. Incapable of moving, she tried to use her natural gifts, but only a tiny gout of golden flame came from her snout. And even that petered out after only a few seconds. That was when she realized what was happening. The trap was draining her Ethera. Panic enveloped her heart as she recognized the dangerous situation for what it was. She writhed and snapped, but her efforts were useless. Steadily, the trap siphoned her strength away until exhaustion gripped her in its claws. She still tried to fight it, but soon enough, she could not even force herself to move. And then, darkness began to close in until, at last, she succumbed to unconsciousness. The last thing she saw before she passed out was a grinning gnome with a blood-red mohawk. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Cabot let out a sigh of relief as he looked at the gold dragon he'd trapped. It was still alive. No trap he could set would be sufficient to drain such a creature's vitality, but it would remain unconscious until he released it. Which he wouldn't. Instead he had plans. "That what I think it is?" asked Brogan, the gnomish tracker who'd first found the dragon's trail. "You knew we were hunting a dragon," Cabot said, glancing at the shaggy-haired gnome. But I thought it was a dragonkin. Like a wyrm or a drake or something," the scout said. "Didn't think we were huntin' a real dragon. And a gold one at that. You sure you want to deal with that kind of weight?" Cabot rolled his eyes. Dragons were powerful enough, but they had to work within the confines dictated by the world tree, just like everyone else. Sure, if he was stupid enough to ever go to the Empire of Scale, or one of their subordinate territories, he might be in trouble. But he didn't think so. Earth was an unclaimed planet, and as such, he could do whatever he wanted. Even if half the universe would look down on him for it. The other half, on the other hand, would be jealous of the opportunity. But that was the nature of things, and just by virtue of his birth, he knew which side he fell on. "I think we'll be just fine," Cabot said. Then to the others he said, "Now bind it, pack it away, and get it to the ritual chamber." Brogan spat, then asked, "You ain't gonna help?" "I have better things to do," was Cabot's answer. The other gnome didn't seem to like that very much, but Cabot was banking on Brogan knowing who held the purse strings. "Just get it done." "Aight," he said. Then to his helpers he said, "Come on boys. You heard 'im. Let's do it." Cabot stayed around long enough to ensure that they weren't going to mess it up, then retreated through the forest, eventually arriving back in Ironshore. Once he did, he quickly made his way to the barracks, where he collected the ritualists he'd hired. They'd been cooling their heels for weeks while Cabot and the others hunted the dragon down, and so, they were eager to finish the job. To that end, Cabot led them into the mines and to the specially prepared chamber where they would drain the dragon's essence. There they set up their rituals as Cabot waited for the scouts to bring the creature along. Once they were finished, the leader asked, "What do you intend to do with the essence?" "I can offer you." "I have big plans," Cabot stated. "Very big plans. Do you need the services of an alchemist?" Cabot shook his head. "No. I intend to use an old friend," he said. "He is an ascendant alchemist working for the Ferdin family." "Oh," said the robed gnome. "Impressive. Making ascendant as a craftsman is no small feat. He must be talented." "Indeed." "What of the other materials?" the ritualist leader asked. Cabot still hadn't learned his name. Nor did he want to. Ritualists who specialized in essence draining were not looked upon favorably in most circles. They were necessary, but most people were uncomfortable with the process. Some people even called it a violation of a creature's soul. A ridiculous superstition, as far as Cabot was concerned. "I hadn't thought about that," he said. "It would be a shame if such a potent resource went to waste." "Do you have something in mind?" "I do. Our organization will be happy to take them off your hands," he said, greedily rubbing his hands together. "You will be compensated, of course. Not only will we pay, handsomely for those resources, but we will also be in your debt. I don't think I need to remind you of how useful that could be, considering the nature of our relationship." Indeed, the only reason Cabot had known to call on Ehrlich in the first place was because he'd used them before. Not on anything so taboo as a dragon or any other sentient race, but that relationship was the poorly concealed secret to his family's power. After all, being able to trap powerful monsters was useless without the means to eke out every ounce of benefit, which was where the ritualists came in. Or rather, the cult of the Devourer. The ritualists came from a comparatively weak sect within the cult, but they were clearly adherents of the religion. Cabot didn't know much about them, save that they worshipped an ancient transcendent being whose power was built on consuming the power of others. He'd never researched more than that because, well, he found the notion far too enticing to trust. The Church of the Devourer wasn't exactly illegal, but the organization was certainly frowned upon in most societies. However, that didn't stop people from seeking out their services, they just didn't talk about it at parties. In any case, Cabot knew just how valuable a good relationship with the church could be, so he said, "That's fine with me. Just let me know what you're willing to pay for the carcass, and we'll address this once you've had a chance to examine it." "The creature is not an it," the ritualist leader stated. "What?" "They have an identity. A gender. They are a living, thinking, and self-aware being with a soul," he responded. "To refer to them as an it robs it of dignity. You're about to drain it of its essence," Cabot stated. "It won't have any dignity left when you're done." "Yes. Our tenets require that we acknowledge what we're taking," he responded. "Make no mistake. A sapient being will die, their soul stripped away so that we may progress. That is as the Devourer dictates." Cabot resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He'd seen the creature. It was nothing more than a giant, unthinking lizard. Perhaps it would one day be more, or it would have been before he captured it, but for now, it was just another monster. He wasn't going to say that, though. Not to a gnome who could, with a single order, ruin all of Cabot's plans. So he just nodded his head in acquiescence, saying, "If you say so." After that, the conversation petered out until a couple of hours later when the hunters arrived. Between them they carried a sizable litter, the contents of which was covered in a heavy tarp. It was curious, but at a glance, there was no way anyone could have identified the bulky burden as a living dragon. At the ritualist's direction, the tracker's turned porters deposited the creature in the center of the room, where the ritualists had drawn their glyphs and sigils. After that, they hurried away, clearly wanting nothing to do with what was going to happen next. "How long?" asked Cabot before they could get started. "Days, at least. Maybe weeks. It depends on how much power she has." Cabot nodded, then said, "Then let's hope for weeks." "I'll leave you to it, then." The lead ritualist nodded, but before Cabot could leave, he said, "Think on what I said. No power comes without sacrifice." Cabot didn't respond, instead pretending that he hadn't heard. As he left the ritual chamber behind, passing into the mines, the whole of his mind was occupied as he considered everything he stood to gain. Though it took almost 3 weeks to fully harden, the soap turned out exactly as Elijah had hoped, which was to say that, while it was a little harsh, it did the job. So it was that, after spending almost 2 years on his island, he was finally able to reach a reasonable level of cleanliness. After that, he collapsed onto the bed, which was made of pleasant-smelling moss and leaves. He looked up at the softly glowing flowers above him, and let out a satisfied sigh. It had taken a long time, but he'd finally achieved a level of comfort that should have been impossible. So of course it couldn't last. "Elijah," came Nerthus's soft voice. Elijah looked up to see the tree spirit standing in his doorway. "What?" he asked. Then, seeing the troubled expression on Nerthus's face, he sighed and said, "Please don't tell me the tower is about to burst again." "It's called a surge," Nerthus said. "But no. The local tower should be subdued for some time yet. Perhaps for as long as the grove persists, if your domain continues to grow." The boundaries of Elijah's territory had continued to expand, but the growth was slow, and even if it kept going at the same rate, it would take months for the tower to be subsumed into his domain. Hopefully, it would happen quickly enough that Elijah wouldn't be forced to challenge it again. He could acknowledge that his previous experience within the tower had been valuable for his personal growth, but that didn't mean he was eager for a repeat. "Here's hoping, then," Elijah said, making a show of crossing his fingers. Nerthus clearly didn't understand the gesture. "Yes. Of course. The reason I've disturbed your rest is more troubling than the tower, though," Nerthus said, nervously looking down as he shuffled from one foot to the next. "That doesn't sound good," Elijah said, sitting up. "What's going on?" "I have been contacted by a powerful being," Nerthus explained. "And she made a request that I don't think we should turn down." Elijah didn't like the way that sounded. He sat up. Powerful being? That's a bit vague, man. Can't you be a little more specific? He asked. In a clear effort to compose himself, Nerthus took a deep breath. A dragon. What? A dragon? Like a huge reptile with wings and... Dragons are technically not reptilian, though they do share some characteristics, he said. But if you ever meet one, which seems likely, if you are to fulfill the request, you should not liken them to lizards. Why? Because they are touchy about that sort of thing, and you do not wish to anger a dragon. I think I probably already know the answer to this, Elijah said. But why not? Because a suitably upset dragon is fully capable of destroying this entire planet. Gotcha. Don't piss dragons off, Elijah said. So if they're so powerful, then why would one need to make a request of me? Nerthus answered, because this planet is young. Its Ethera is weak enough that a fully grown dragon couldn't survive here. However, that is not to say that they couldn't destroy this whole planet from afar. Or if they set foot on the surface. Elijah sighed. He certainly didn't like the sound of that. Nor was he thrilled with the implications behind the statement. It felt like Nerthus was telling him that if he didn't do what this dragon asked, then he would run the risk of having his entire planet destroyed. What does this dragon want? Something was stolen from her, Nerthus said. In fact, it is, at this moment, only a few miles away. She wishes for you to retrieve it. That sounded very vague to Elijah, and he said as much before asking what, precisely, had been stolen. Her daughter, Nerthus said. She is barely past the hatchling stage, though even that should have been plenty to survive a new planet such as this. However, she was abducted soon after her arrival and brought to the settlement across the strait. Why? Elijah asked. I mean, if dragons are so powerful, why would anyone do something so stupid? Nerthus sighed. I have mentioned this a few times, but this universe can be roughly divided into two philosophies, he said. On one side, there are those who see the world as theirs by right. They consume, using any means they can to progress. On the other are those like you who, instead, seek to harmonize with the natural world. The first way is faster, but it comes at a cost. Once a resource is used, it is gone. These devourers must continuously seek new sources of power, Nerthus went on. They are, in a very real way, a spreading virus that will consume the universe. The worst of them adhere to the Church of the Devourer, a transcendent being older than your world and much more powerful than anything you can imagine. But these devourers, their way works, right? Certainly. And the other side? Elijah asked, already guessing the answer. Still, he wanted it confirmed. Preservationists seek to cultivate relationships with sources of power, he said. For instance, if a devourer were to encounter this grove, he would harvest the ancestral tree and use the wood to fuel his own advancement. How? Potions. Rituals to temporarily provide an ideal cultivation environment. Sacrifices. They might even consume the wood via mastication, Nerthus explained. The methods are many and varied. But the results are the same. They get a little stronger, and this grove would cease to exist. Once they'd wrung every ounce of power from it, they would move on to the next. And the next after that. Over and over until they reached the pinnacle, or there was nothing left. So, I'm already a preservationist, huh? Elijah asked. Or does harvesting the berries in this grove mark me as a devourer? What if I was to? You wouldn't have been offered the Druid archetype if you were the sort who might become a devourer. Oh. But most people are somewhere in between, Nerthus admitted. And though I may not like it, I can't blame people for grasping at power. However, there are those who take things too far. That is what we're dealing with here. How so? Dragons are some of the most powerful creatures in the known universe, Nerthus answered. The people who kidnapped the young one intend to drain her. Drain her? Wait, they're going to use a sentient creature as fuel? Elijah asked. Is that even allowed? Of course not. Nerthus exclaimed. But there are those who will do anything for power. Elijah shook his head. The idea was abhorrent, but he could understand the motivation. On Earth, people had done horrible things for money and power, so the idea that some would be willing to sacrifice a sapient creature just to enhance their own cultivation wasn't all that surprising. Greed, it seemed, was a constant, even in the wider universe. What am I supposed to do? Asked Elijah. The task is simple. Retrieve the young one. He waved his hand, and a notification bloomed before Elijah's eyes. A powerful entity has offered you a task. Objective: rescue the child. Reward: blessing of the dragon, Alyssa. Do you accept? This looks like the tasks I did in the tower, Elijah said. Then he looked up at Nerthus and asked how. Sufficient power gives you the option of offering official tasks through the system, he said. I am merely the vessel by which the dragon acted. What is the blessing of the dragon? Nerthus shook his head. That I do not know, he said. It could be a useful item. It could be Ethereum. Or anything else. There is no limit, save for the level of power of the offered reward. Which is enough to make a difference. Not enough to change the fate of this world, Nerthus said. So, will you take the task? I have one more question, Elijah said. Why me? Nerthus cocked his head to the side as if confused. Then he said, because you are a druid. Yeah, no, I know I am. But what difference does that make? I'm sure there are lots of druids. No. There aren't. Perhaps a few thousand satisfied the requirements of that archetype. Of those, only a couple hundred managed to survive. It is a prestigious and rare archetype. Even more so because you have managed to gain power so quickly. Usually, druids are much slower and far less combative. The more action-oriented of the archetype tend to die early deaths. Oh. I don't know if I should feel good about myself for surviving or terrible for all the people who died. Both, said Nerthus. Still, that doesn't answer the question. What makes me being a druid so important? Elijah asked. Dragons trust druids. Why? Mutual benefit and aligned philosophies, Nerthus stated. That is not to say they are one entity. Dragons tend to be proud, and though dragons and druids have often allied with one another, there is still some level of animosity. However, with something of this nature, there is no better ally than a druid. Elijah still didn't quite understand. It was just an archetype, which in turn, was just a means to get some useful spells. But he wasn't going to argue with the tree spirit's assertion. Okay, I thought of another question. How did the dragon contact you? Very painfully, Nerthus answered. I barely survived the touch of her mind. Oh. So, will you accept the task? The tree spirit asked. Elijah was torn. He had seen how powerful the people across the strait were when they'd killed the guardian. So what chance did he have of going up against an entire settlement? But then again, could he sit on the sidelines and let an innocent person die? Sure, that person was a dragon, but that didn't really matter. She was just a child. What kind of monster would he have to be to ignore her plight? And then there was the reward. The blessing of the dragon was a bit ambiguous, but Nerthus seemed convinced that it would be worth it. Besides, if dragons were so powerful, then a blessing bearing their name was clearly something worth pursuing. Just like that, Elijah knew what he would do. So he accepted the task, then told Nerthus his decision. The tree spirit seemed relieved, but he was also clearly worried. I need to get ready, Elijah said. And so he did. He didn't have much in the way of supplies to gather, but he did grab his staff. One thing he'd discovered was that, so long as he was wearing an item, even if it was something like a knife stuck to his belt, or a pack secured to his back, it would transform right alongside him. That would have been good to know before he'd challenged the tower, but back then, He'd just assumed it was just his staff that transformed with him. So he'd never even tried it. Now he knew though, and so he could prepare accordingly. After stuffing one of his woven satchels full of berries and mushrooms, Elijah stuck his pilfered knife into a homemade sheath at his waist. Then, after checking everything a second time, he bade goodbye to Nerthus, who wished him luck. Then he set off across his island. Soon enough, he reached his destination. The boat hadn't been in the water since he'd helped kill the trio of invaders who'd infiltrated his island, and the months that had passed since then had left it a little worse for wear. Still, it wasn't rotted, so he figured it would hold together at least long enough for him to reach the other shore. However, Elijah wasn't going to set off until after dark. So he settled down to wait. In that time, he focused on what he planned to do. He didn't know the layout of the settlement which, by that point, had become a proper city, with thousands of residents, but he hoped he could figure things out when he got there. It wasn't much of a plan, but he didn't know how else to accomplish the task at hand. Eventually, night began to fall, accompanied by a light drizzle. Elijah looked to the west and saw dark clouds on the horizon. There was a storm coming, and he could only hope that he had the means to survive it. Rain fell in heavy drops that reminded Elijah that spring would soon overtake winter. But it had yet to arrive, as evidenced by the biting cold that refused to relinquish its grip. Elijah ignored it as he pushed the small boat out into the sea. He had endured worse, and he knew his suffering had only begun. He could only hope that it would be worth it. Once the water reached his waist, he climbed into the boat, grabbed the oars, and started to row. With his enhanced constitution, it was trivial to send the vessel cutting through the waves, and soon enough, he was skipping along the surface with some speed. Still, the strait was wide, and even as the darkness of full night enveloped him, he continued to row towards his destination. Even with his augmented strength, it took Elijah over 2 hours to cross the strait, partially due to the distance, but also because the boat itself had never been built for speed. Still, he made it without much difficulty. Upon reaching the shore, which was just as rocky as that of his island, he climbed out of the boat and dragged it out of the sea. For his point of ingress, Elijah had chosen a spot about a mile up the shore from the edge of the settlement. He'd done so in an effort to avoid detection. After all, the town was well lit, and it would have been tempting fate to assume he could arrive at the dock unseen. Thankfully, the tree line was only a few feet from the shore, which allowed Elijah to quickly drag the boat under cover. Once that was taken care of, Elijah recast his enhancements: essence of the wolf, essence of the monkey, and aura of renewal before casting shape of the predator. As always, one with nature was still active as well. Once he'd assumed the form of a mist panther, he set off through the forest. As he slowly padded through the woods, nimbly leaping over fallen trees, and across the dips in the terrain, he sorely missed the awareness of his domain. He hadn't felt it back in the tower, but in the weeks since returning to the island, he'd grown used to knowing everything about his surroundings. Fortunately, one with nature acted as a watered-down version of the skill. The breadth of knowledge it granted was far more limited, and it only extended a dozen yards around him, but it was much better than nothing. Gradually, he covered the ground between his landing spot to the clearing surrounding the city. As he did, he tried to plan for what he would find. 100 possibilities flitted through his mind, but they were all useless until he knew what obstacles might bar his way. He reached the edge of the forest, then bounded up a tree, until he was 20 or 30 feet from the ground. From that elevated position, he gazed out across the clearing at the settlement. The first thing he noticed was that it was far more developed than he'd expected. The buildings weren't so different from what he might have seen from industrious humans, though the few residents he saw put the lie to that image. Gnomes, dwarves, and goblins made up the majority of the population, but he also saw a couple of creatures he could only categorize as dark elves. Because of their onyx skin, refined features, tapered ears, and stark white hair, Elijah couldn't think of them as anything else. After watching for a while, Elijah resigned himself to the inevitable. He could only glean so much information from afar. He would have to enter the settlement if he wanted to find the dragon's daughter and complete the task he'd been given. So, after only a little more hesitation, he descended from his perch and embraced guise of the unseen before setting off across the clearing. However, after only a few feet, he felt something in the ambient Ethera shift, a feeling that was quickly followed by a sense of vague unease. When he felt that, he stopped in his tracks and retreated a few feet, until he felt things return to normal. It took a few more passes before he found the line of demarcation. After a few more minutes of study, during which he followed the line across the clearing, he determined that it surrounded the settlement. With that in mind, and without any other indications as to the purpose, Elijah set out to test it further. As he did, he determined that it clearly wasn't dangerous, but there was something about it that tickled at the back of his mind. So, after finding a hollow that was out of line of sight of the settlement, he shifted back to his human form. Then, he crossed the line, and just as he'd expected, he felt nothing. That cemented it. The line wasn't so different from the boundaries of his domain. However, instead of granting awareness, it was meant to keep the wildlife away. Perhaps it even prevented dimensional rifts from forming. He didn't know enough to draw any further conclusions, so he retreated out of sight, and waited for his Ethera to regenerate. Once it did, he once again assumed the form of a mist panther and stalked forward. After crossing the line, the sense of unease returned, but it wasn't enough to dissuade him from continuing. Perhaps that was because he wasn't truly an animal. Or maybe his attributes protected him. It might have even been one with nature keeping the boundary from fully affecting him. Whatever the case, it was easily endured, so he continued to stalk toward the settlement. As he drew closer, more of the town's details became apparent. It was lit by what looked like gas lamps, though the light was different enough that Elijah thought they must have been powered by Ethera. The buildings themselves were made from a mixture of quarried stone and wood from the surrounding forests, and from an architectural perspective, were entirely unimpressive in their mundanity. Elijah padded forward, keeping low and trusting the shadows and guise of the unseen to keep him hidden. Even so, he took great pains to avoid the residents. By that point, it was well past midnight, so there weren't many out and about, but there were enough that Elijah had to choose his route into the city with care. Fortunately, there were no active defenses or guards, otherwise, he might have been found. Over the next few hours, Elijah explored the city, and as he did, he was struck by just how normal everything seemed. The residents were all mythological creatures, at least from his perspective, but they acted much as he'd have expected from humans. He saw them eating, drinking, laughing with their friends, and enjoying all sorts of leisure activities. He passed a few taverns, and he even crept into a couple, and even when he was focused on the task before him, Elijah couldn't help but be reminded of just how lonely he was. It had been years since he'd spoken to another human being, much less done something so mundane as hung out at a bar. Once Elijah had taken that sort of thing for granted, but now, he knew just how valuable companionship really was. More, the city and the normalcy of its atmosphere suggested that the world hadn't fared as poorly as he had expected. Certainly, people had died, but if the collection of gnomes, goblins, and dwarves could live normal lives, then so could the human population that had been lucky enough to have survived the world's transition. Seeing the city also awakened within him a resolve to find other survivors. To search out his family. Before, it had seemed impossible. Now, though, he felt confident that he could traverse the world with some degree of safety. After all, he'd survived the Sea of Sorrows and the primordial jungle. Surely, that was more dangerous than whatever he'd find in Earth's wilderness. In any case, Elijah couldn't focus on that. Instead, he continued to search the settlement for any hints as to where he might find the dragon's daughter. Despite his efforts, as dawn approached, he still hadn't discovered any leads. So, with the population beginning to stir, he had no choice but to retreat, quickly returning to the forest and settling in to observe the town by the light of day. Soon enough, the sun rose, and the town came to life as hundreds of people set about their daily tasks. Elijah focused on two groups in particular, though. One headed into the surrounding forests, while another went to the mine behind the town. After finding a secluded cave a few miles away from the city, Elijah settled in for a few hours' worth of sleep. When he awoke, he took off through the forest to search out the townspeople who'd gone into the woods. The first group he found were loggers, while the second were clearly hunting the local wildlife. From a perch on the thick branch of an oak tree, Elijah watched as the hunters took down a bear the size of a compact car. The beast put up a decent fight, but the group of 5 hunters were well prepared and clearly practiced at their craft. So the animal fell without inflicting much damage on its killers. After that, they set about processing the creature, and when they finished and headed back to the town, they left nothing behind. After seeing that, Elijah continued to search the forest, and he came across more hunts in progress. None of them even vaguely suspected he was around, which, though unsurprising, was gratifying. Emboldened by that success, he followed each of the hunting parties until he could confirm that they weren't keeping the dragon's daughter hidden away. It took most of the day, but by the time the sun set, he'd ruled the hunters out as the kidnappers. So, with night falling, he retreated to his cave, and got a few more hours of rest. When he awoke, it was nearly midnight. While he'd slept, the rain had returned in full force, which provided that much more cover as he crept toward the mine. It was situated at the base of one of the surrounding mountains, and the entrance was guarded by a few scattered buildings. Elijah searched them, though he found nothing but administrative facilities that looked strangely reminiscent of what he'd expect from a similar human-run operation, a couple of storehouses filled with various mining supplies, and a guard post manned by a couple of dozing goblins. He also made a couple of discoveries along the way. First, the system's translation feature apparently extended to the written word, so he had no issues reading the files in the administrative room. Second, that ability gave him a little context for the mining operation, chiefly that the settlement was called Ironshore, was run by a group known as the Green Mountain Mining Guild, and that they were almost exclusively interested in something called true iron. None of that was pertinent to his task, so he only spent a few minutes reading the files. Still, it was nice to get some information about his neighbors. He crept past the goblin guards, entering the mine. At first, he took things slowly, but after a few minutes, it became clear that the mine was entirely deserted. So he sped up, abandoning guise of the unseen in favor of alacrity. He passed carts and piles of ore along the way, but for the first hour or so, he found nothing out of the ordinary. As far as he could tell, it was just an ordinary mine. Then, Elijah noticed that the density of the ambient Ethera began to rise. As he continued on, he came to a fork in the tunnel. Down the left path, the Ethera remained mostly stable, but to the right, it continued to thicken. Reasoning that had to mean something, he chose the right path. Over the next hour, he was confronted with a few more such choices, and each time, he decided to follow the Ethera, reasoning that it would mean something. Along the way, he paid special attention to the senses granted by one with nature, a good strategy, because otherwise, he never would have found his quarry. He was slowly padding down the mine shaft when he felt something that shouldn't have been there. To his left, he could sense the normal life insects and the like that indicated there should be a tunnel there, but when he looked, he saw nothing but a solid wall of rock. Curious, Elijah reached out with a paw, and to his shock, he saw it pass through the wall. He snatched his paw back, then inspected it. It seemed the same as always, and he hadn't felt any pain to indicate that it was dangerous. So it only took a few seconds for him to conclude that the wall was some sort of illusion. Still, even though such an explanation made perfect sense, Elijah felt a tremble of fear as he pushed through. To his relief, nothing bad happened, and he sighed in relief as he stepped into a new tunnel. However, this one was different. Rougher. It didn't bear the same wooden beams that supported the integrity of the rest of the tunnels. Likely that was because it was so small. The rest of the mine's passages were at least 20 feet across and just as high, but this new tunnel was maybe a quarter of that. Wide enough to permit passage of a couple of the small gnomes or goblins, but wider-shouldered dwarves would have to traverse it single file. Elijah padded down the tunnel as it sloped dramatically downward, twisting and turning every few steps. Then, finally, he reached a point where it opened into a wide chamber. It only took him a few seconds to confirm that he'd found his destination, because in the center of the room lay a large, curled form that could only be a young dragon. Golden scales glinted in the flickering light of a dozen torches, giving the illusion that the figure was moving. But aside from the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the dragon was entirely motionless. The creature had been described as little more than infant, and yet, she was at least 7 feet long, from delicate snout to tapered tail. With wings folded against her back, she had the sinuous shape of a serpent, and yet, 4 legs were tucked under her form. In short, she was a stunning creature, and for a moment, Elijah could only stare in awe. And then, as he continued to study the scene before him, anger stared to overwhelm the sense of astonishment. Because she was clearly injured, with one of her legs having clearly been broken. Blood coated one of her folded wings, and a long gash stretched from the base of her tail to her ribs. Even more disturbingly, a half-dozen hooded figures that, from their size, had to be goblins or gnomes, were busy drawing complex symbols on the stone ground. Or a few of them were, at least. The others followed behind, sprinkling glittering dust on the still-wet paint. No. Wait. Elijah caught another whiff, and he instantly recognized the smell. Blood, mixed with something else and pulsing with Ethera. A low growl escaped from between his lips, though he was thankfully far enough away that the gnomes didn't hear. It didn't take much intuition to see what was happening. The gnomes or goblins, perhaps, were setting up a ritual of some sort. That tracked with what Nerthus had described. They wanted to harvest the dragon, taking whatever made her special in order to enhance their own cultivation. Or perhaps to sell it. He didn't know which, but it really didn't matter either. Even if he hadn't had the task spurring him forward, there was no way he could see what was happening and not act. Crouching low to the ground, his tail swished back and forth. Then he pounced, using Predator Strike. His claw ripped through the gnome's robes, cutting deep before shattering his ribs. Without stopping, he snapped out, clamping his jaws on the screaming figure's head, then bit down. The creature's skull shattered. But Elijah wasn't finished. Instead, he bounded toward the next closest figure, and when they turned, he saw nothing but wide-eyed surprise. He pounced on her, then swiped his claws across her exposed throat. He felt a slight resistance at the last second, but it wasn't enough to stop him. With 2 down, Elijah was gone before the rest even knew what had happened. He melted into the shadows, letting guise of the unseen settle onto his shoulders. Nestled in the shadows, he knew he was completely undetectable. One of the remaining 4 figures whipped around, saying, "What?" Another locked eyes on Elijah's second victim, and upon seeing the bright, red blood pooling around her fallen body, she screamed, "Reyna." "Don't move," said the third, his voice full of authority. He raised his hand, and Elijah felt Ethera gathering at his fingertips. That was enough to mark him as his next victim. Elijah darted from the shadows, then used Predator Strike and Venom Strike at the same time. However, he was surprised when his claw met stiff resistance. It wasn't enough to stop his attack entirely, but it was plenty to prevent a mortal strike. Still, his claw traced a line across the gnome's shoulder, sending a spray of blood arcing through the air. Elijah never stopped moving, instead melting into the shadows with guise of the unseen. Against animals, such a strategy wouldn't have been possible. But the gnome's senses just weren't sharp enough to track him, especially after he started attacking the torches. One after another, they fell. They weren't extinguished, but it was enough to deepen the shadows. Meanwhile, the neurotoxin of Venom Strike had begun to do its job. The leader fell, seizing as he hit the ground. Pink foam escaped his mouth as he rasped poison. Elijah didn't pay attention. Instead, he stalked his remaining prey. There were only 3 left, and they planted themselves with their backs against the wall. All 3 were gnomes. 1 male. 2 female. As if that mattered. With what they'd done to the dragon, they deserved whatever he could dish out, regardless of gender. Elijah circled to the right, careful to avoid the guttering torches. He could taste the gnome's fear. He could feel it in his bones. And there was a part of him that reveled in it, that felt justified in striking terror into the hearts of people who thought nothing of killing and harvesting a sapient creature. He padded closer, staying close to the ground. Then he pounced, once again using Predator Strike. And just like before, he was met with significant resistance that slowed his claws. It didn't matter. One strike followed the next, and he could feel the invisible shield weakening. Finally, he broke free and gutted one of the females, raking his claws across the gnome's midsection. His innards spilled out, filling the chamber with the foul stench of ruptured intestines. But the kill had taken too long, giving the remaining two a chance to respond. And respond they did. Elijah felt something slam into his ribs, flipping him over and sending him sprawling across the ground. He recovered quickly, but judging by the burning pain on his side, he'd picked up a serious wound. Even more distressingly, another unseen force slammed into him a second later. Then another. Elijah rolled with the momentum, then launched himself at the wall and used it to spring into another attack. His claws raked across an invisible shield, doing nothing. He'd learned his lesson, though, so he kept moving, diving back into the shadows. "It's bleeding. Just follow the trail," screeched the remaining female. Elijah kept going, moving as quickly as he could. But he didn't need to inspect his wounds to know that he might have bitten off more than he could chew. So long as he could strike from the shadows, his Miss Panther form was deadly. However, in a straight-up fight, it left a lot to be desired, at least in regard to durability. Where did it go? Over there. Something thudded into the wall across the room. Did you get it? I don't know. They were jumping at shadows, which Elijah understood. The combination of his black coat and the dying light of the flickering torches had created a nearly perfect environment for him. But even if he could easily remain undetected and escape if he so desired, the gnomes were still alert enough to see him coming. But Elijah refused to abandon his task. So he continued to circle, trusting that his aura of renewal-enhanced regeneration could keep him alive, even with his wounds. "Is it gone?" asked one, her voice trembling. The other hissed, "I have no idea." "What was it?" "It looked like a big cat," the female whispered. "But how?" "With the barrier." That's when Elijah pounced, his claws raking across her shield. He could feel it weakening with every subsequent attack. He could use Venom Strike and Predator Strike in tandem, and perhaps he could get through, but that would leave him dangerously close to exhaustion. No, it was better to hit and run, over and over, until she was vulnerable. So that's what Elijah did. Each swipe he took came with the risk of taking another hit himself. But so long as he kept moving, he felt confident in his chances. The gnomes weren't fighters. He could tell that much. That made them prone to panic and more, the constant flow of adrenaline would eventually take its toll. After 20 minutes, they tried to escape. That was the opening Elijah needed to finish the female off. He pounced on her, driving her to the ground. Her partner continued running toward the tunnel as Elijah's claws flashed. Once. Twice. 3 times. She screamed. Elijah paid it no mind as he finally broke through her shield and eviscerated her small body. She died soon after he clamped down on the back of her neck, crushing her vertebrae and severing her spine. The final gnome only made it a few feet into the tunnel before Elijah caught up. However, when he leaped upon the lone survivor's back, he got a surprise when the creature disappeared, appearing a few feet away. As Elijah recovered, the gnome raised his hands. Ethera gathered in a flash and then, suddenly, Elijah felt something at his feet. He looked down to see ethereal chains encircling his legs. He tried to pull free, but it did no good. "Stupid animal," the gnome panted, his shoulders sagging. "Suppose it's not all bad, though." "You're what?" "Level 28. Decent materials. Bones for weapons. Pelt for a..." Elijah wasn't going to listen to that. Instead, seeing that he couldn't escape the gnome's spell, he knew he had no choice but to play his ace. So he shifted back to human form, pointed his staff at his enemy, and cast Storm's Fury. Lightning lashed out, and the shocked gnome went flying backwards, hitting the wall of the narrow tunnel and collapsing to the ground. But it didn't kill him. "What? That's not..." Elijah cast again, but even though the gnome was once again knocked back into the wall, he didn't look all that injured. So, after focusing on his core, Elijah decided to use something with a little more oomph. He cast Swarm. At first it didn't seem like anything had happened, but then, a buzzing sound filled the air. The gnome said something derisive, but Elijah paid no attention. He knew what was coming. "Ow," said the short figure, slapping a hand against his neck. It was prelude to disaster, at least from the gnome's perspective, and a second later, a swarm of stinging flies descended upon him. Elijah had no idea why the shield did nothing to stop them, but he wasn't going to argue with it. Instead, he watched with stoic fury as the swarm's afflictions took hold. The gnome screamed. Elijah watched. Even after the spell holding him in place faded, he didn't move until, at last, the swarm dissipated, leaving only a diseased corpse behind. Once he was certain that the gnome was dead, as evidenced by the influx of kill energy that pushed him closer to level 29, he slapped a hand over his side and cast Touch of Nature. The bleeding stopped, but he didn't dare use more than one cast, lest he not have enough Ethera to heal the dragon. With that, he dragged the gnome's body back to the ritual chamber, then cast Healing Rain. Clouds swirled, covering the center of the room, and covering the dragon in rejuvenating precipitation. Perhaps more importantly, it washed away the glittering paint the ritualists had been using to draw symbols on the ground. With that done, Elijah set his sights on the corpses. He looted them, coming up with a couple of purses containing a few strange coins, the robes, and a pair of new knives. He slipped his ill-gotten gains into his woven pack, then headed toward the prone dragon. He laid a hand on the golden scales, feeling her breathing. She was warmer than he'd expected, hammering home the fact that she was not a cold-blooded reptile. More, he felt the mass of Ethera swirling in her body. It was no wonder the gnomes had been trying to harvest her. It didn't excuse their actions, but he understood. Taking a deep breath, Elijah channeled Ethera into Touch of Nature, sending a jolt of healing through the creature. When that did nothing, he cast it again. Then again after that. 2 more times he cast, but the dragon was unaffected. He wanted to do more, but his core was dry. So Elijah waited, and just like he'd done with the panther what felt like an eternity ago, he healed the creature each time his Ethera recovered enough to facilitate a cast of Touch of Nature. It took 2 more hours before the dragon awoke. And she did so with explosive violence, raking her claws across his chest and tearing open a gaping wound. Elijah sprang backward, but he knew he could do nothing to stop the vicious monster he'd made the mistake of saving. Her eyes were wild as she stepped on his chest, and smoke curled up from her flared nostrils. "Human," she growled, her voice deep but feminine. "Why? What?" Elijah channeled Touch of Nature through his body as he choked out, "I was sent to rescue you." That's when her eyes lost their wildness, and she glanced around. When she saw the bodies of the gnomes, her expression softened and she stepped back. "Oh," she said. Then she collapsed, once again losing consciousness. Elijah shook his head, then used the last of his pool of Ethera to cast Touch of Nature on himself. After that, he just lay there, his breath shallow as he tried to deal with the pain of the wound she had caused. Once he'd regained enough Ethera, he cast the spell again. It took 2 more casts before the wound closed. But by that point, he heard voices coming from the entrance tunnel. Glancing at the dragon, he saw that she was still unconscious. And after his battle against the gnomes and the misunderstanding with the dragon, he was in no shape to fight. He'd healed enough to get around, but anything beyond that would take some time, and more than a few more casts of Touch of Nature. Which left him with only one option, though he had no idea if it would work. But given the situation, he didn't think he had much choice. So Elijah painfully pushed himself to his feet, then staggered to where the dragon had collapsed. Then, he knelt beside her form, placed his hand on her side, then used the teleport function of Ancestral Circle. He felt the spell tugging at him, and him alone. But he wouldn't allow that. Instead, he forced more Ethera into the spell so it would accept the dragon as well. It wasn't so different than when he used the same method to bolster the effect of nature's bounty. though it was significantly more difficult, and at first, the spell refused to cooperate. But then, suddenly, it snapped into place. Elijah screamed as pain tore through him, and just as the spell enveloped the pair of them, he saw a group of gnomes and goblins appear at the mouth of the tunnel. Then, he was gone, and for a split second, he felt like he was being ripped into 1,000 pieces. He thudded to the ground as he and the dragon appeared in his grove. Blood spurted from 100 wounds. Vaguely, he heard someone shouting his name, but by that point, the blood loss had begun to take hold. Still, before he passed out, he managed to use the very last bit of his Ethera to cast healing rain. Then, everything went black. Elijah awoke and for a long time, just lay there unmoving. His body was still a mess. He didn't need to inspect his wounds to recognize that much, but he didn't feel like he had the energy to do anything about it. Nor did he have any idea how much time had passed. But one thing he did know was that he'd survived, and judging by the steady sound of heavy breathing nearby, the dragon had as well. For a while, that was enough. Soon enough, though, Elijah's eyes fluttered open, and he saw a clear blue sky looking down on him. After taking a deep breath, he cast healing rain, and watched the clouds coalesce above him before they dumped their regenerative payload on him. Then, he began the arduous process of healing himself via touch of nature. He felt terrible, and his limbs refused to respond to his instructions. So he channeled the spell without direction, letting the formless healing energy flood his body. It was inefficient, but given the sheer volume of his injuries, there wasn't that much wasted Ethera. He wasn't sure precisely how long he lay there, but it was at least 1 day. Maybe more, considering that, while waiting for his Ethera to regenerate, he often dozed off. It wasn't outside the realm of possibility that, on a few of those occasions, he slept through an entire night. But eventually, Elijah healed enough to sit up. Predictably, when he did, he saw the familiar confines of his grove staring back at him. He glanced down at his previously unblemished arm, where he saw a series of pale, thin scars marring his skin. Elijah sighed. At the rate he was picking up scars, he'd soon become a malformed mess. Glancing to his side, he saw a mass of golden scales. But given that the dragon was still alive, he could see that she was still breathing. He reasoned that he should take care of himself first, then heal her once he was healthy. So Elijah continued on his long road of regeneration, renewing healing rain every time it fell away, and using touch of nature in the interim. And over the next day, he gradually returned to health. Then, he started in on the dragon. With the benefit of time on his side, Elijah could better gauge what was happening, and it didn't take him long to recognize that the dragon's pool of vitality, or life energy, was far larger than his own. When he healed her, it was like trying to fill a swimming pool with a bucket. He was making progress, but it was going to take a long time. So he bent himself to the task. Fortunately, he was in his grove, so food was no issue. And it only took a quick trip up to his tree house to get water. Nerthus had told him that it would be difficult to exhaust its water stores, so his basic needs were easily met. However, beyond satisfying those necessities, he had a hard time focusing on anything but the task in front of him. That got a little better as the days passed, which hinted that the issue was related to forcing Ancestral Circle to teleport both him and the dragon, but beyond that, he was unsure what else to expect. And so, days passed as he slowly healed the dragon, one touch of nature at a time. In a way, it reminded him of how he'd healed the guardian panther so long ago. But as difficult as it had been to heal the panther, it couldn't even begin to compare, at least in terms of how much Ethera it took to doing the same for the young dragon. But Elijah persisted. Curiously, Nerthus remained absent. At first, Elijah didn't even spare the tree spirit's absence a second thought. After all, he'd only had a handful of conversations with him since making first contact. However, as days passed without Nerthus making an appearance, Elijah started to worry. Not that it did any good. The tree spirit showed up when he wanted to, and there was nothing Elijah could do to change that. So he pushed that from his mind and focused on healing the dragon. And finally, a week later, Elijah succeeded. Thankfully, the dragon didn't respond as she had in the ritual chamber. Instead, after her eyes fluttered open, she craned her long neck and looked around before focusing on Elijah. She stared at him for a long moment before saying, "I apologize for my actions, Druid." Then, she collapsed into unconsciousness once again. Over the following few days, she awoke a few more times, but she didn't speak again until, as far as Elijah could tell, she'd finally reached perfect health. At that point she said, "Where am I? What happened to the devourers?" "You're in my grove," Elijah answered. Aside from shifting to a more comfortable position, she still hadn't moved. "You're safe. How did we escape?" "The leader would not have allowed me to leave without a fight. I used a spell to teleport us here," Elijah said. She narrowed her eyes, then leaned closer, and for a moment, Elijah felt like he was being sized up by a much larger predator. Then she said, "You are not strong enough to do that." He sighed, then sat down. "You're not wrong about that," he admitted. "It nearly ripped me to pieces." He raised his arm, showing off the pattern of thin scars. "And I have the scars to show for it." "I see. So how did you get caught?" "No offense, but those guys didn't seem all that strong," Elijah said. "And you, well, you're a dragon." Before, he hadn't really understood why Nerthus had spoken of dragons with such reverence. However, after seeing the one before him, he thought he'd begun to understand just how much more powerful the species was. She was only a child, and yet, Elijah was certain that if she so wished it, she could tear him to pieces with only minimal effort. "They trapped me," she said. "I was foolish and hubristic. Despite my mother's words of caution, I thought this world beneath me. I was wrong." Elijah didn't probe the topic any further. Instead, he changed the subject, asking, "So, what do I call you?" "I am Sarah Linissa." Mind if I just call you Sarah?" he asked. "Because that's a mouthful." She cocked her massive head to the side as if thinking it over, then said, "I suppose that will do." "So, what happens now?" "Because I just checked and my task isn't complete." "Task? Wait, did my mother send you? Are you going to eat me if I say she did?" Elijah asked. "What? No." Sarah shouted. "Why would I eat you? You attacked me for healing you back in the ritual chamber," Elijah reminded her. "Just covering my bases here." "Bases? Don't worry about it. My point is that I really don't want to get attacked again. So, please don't. Because I don't think I can stop you if you want to eat me." "I'm not going to eat you." That sounds like what someone who intended to eat me would say. It was a strange thing, watching a dragon roll her eyes. Curiously human, but also undeniably alien. Either way, Elijah found it disconcerting. "I have no intention of eating you," she said. "So please just leave it at that." "Fair enough. My original question still stands. I'm not saying the only reason I rescued you was to complete that task, but I'm not saying it didn't play a huge part in my decision," he said. "What was the objective?" "It just said to rescue the child." "Child? Ugh. She would phrase it like that," Sarah said. "I'm almost a century old, and she still treats me like an infant." She let out a snort. "So infuriating. Again, please don't eat me." "I am not going to eat you." "Good. Because I'm sure I don't taste very good. Too little fat." "What is wrong with you?" she asked. "Nothing. I just don't want to get eaten. Plus, I've been living on this island alone for close to 2 years at this point. I mean, I did talk to some nice walrus people, but they weren't real, so I contend that doesn't count. There's Nerthus, too, but he's a tree. Or a tree spirit, I guess. I'm not sure where he ends and the tree begins, if I'm honest. He'd probably tell me if I asked, but that just felt a little rude, you know." "What is a walrus? And why would they not be real?" she asked. Never mind. My point is that I really don't want to get eaten. I can't stress that enough. I swear not to eat you. Even if you're annoyed with me. Because. No matter what, I won't eat you. There. Satisfied? Well, not really. Who knows if you're a liar? I mean, you seem trustworthy as far as giant, golden dragons are concerned, but I'll admit that I'm not the best judge of character. I mean, I had this girlfriend back in high school who was sleeping with half the football team, and I never. Can you please stop babbling? Sarah interrupted. Oh, right. Just haven't had a lot of conversational opportunities lately. So about my quest. Or task, I guess. Not sure if there's a difference, but we mustn't get the terminology wrong. Sarah sighed, a bit of a spark escaping from between her lips. Don't roast me either. The dragon didn't respond, which Elijah thought was moderately concerning. Instead, she asked, how did my mother contact you? She didn't. She talked to Nerthus. This is the tree spirit you mentioned, she asked. Elijah nodded, then hiked his thumb in the direction of the ancestral tree. Lives over there. But sometimes, he visits me in the tree house. Sarah nodded, then pushed herself to her feet. When she did, Elijah could only stare in awe. Her form was even more magnificent than he'd first thought. Stop staring. It's weird. Don't stare. Gotcha, he said, though he didn't look away. Sarah let out a huff, then headed toward the ancestral tree. When she reached it, she called out, Tree Spirit. Speak to me. Nerthus appeared only a moment later, and Elijah groaned, Oh, come on. I tried to get you to come out like 10 times over the past week, and nothing. But she calls for you one time, and you just pop right up. She's a dragon, he said unapologetically, as if that was explanation enough. Looking at Sarah, Elijah couldn't really argue with that assessment. Please contact my mother and tell her I am safe, Sarah said. Nerthus disappeared, merging with his branch. He was gone for only about 30 seconds before he reappeared, saying, Your mother wishes for your return. Consent, and Elijah will complete his task. But she said I could stay on this. She was very specific about the conditions. She said, and I quote, You have visited the new world. Return and continue your training. The great. Ugh. Fine. I'll go. Just do it. Wait, what's going on? Elijah asked. The tree spirit is going to use his connection to the world tree to send me home, Sarah said. Once I'm back in Cabales, you'll get your reward. Ah. Makes sense, I guess, he said, tapping his lip. Except for, the whole thing. You're just going to connect to the world tree. And what the hell, Nerthus? Could you have just sent me away? He sighed, then before either Sarah or Nerthus could respond, Elijah said, You know what? Never mind. The answer's probably just magic anyway. Right? It's magic. It's not magic, said Nerthus. Fine. Carry on, I guess. Stupid trees and magic and dragons. He looked up at Sarah, then held up his hands, Not you. Obviously. As the only dragon I've ever met who, let's remember, promised not to eat me, I'm very much on your side. And your mom's. And any other dragon out there, I guess. Let's just say I'm pro-dragon all the way. To drive his point home, he held up 2 thumbs. Sarah, for her part, just shook her head, then placed her foreleg on the tree's trunk. Looking down at Elijah, she said, You're weird. But thank you. Without waiting for a response, she disappeared. Nerthus wilted, merging with his tree without another word. That left Elijah alone. Again, what's new, he muttered to himself. However, at least he'd completed his task, which was important enough. He couldn't help but think that he'd have traded the reward for a little company, though. Congratulations. You have completed a task. Stand by for reward. Elijah held his breath until the next notification flashed before his eyes. Blessing of the Dragon received. Please choose which form it takes. Core advancement. Item, Wings of the Dragon. Spell, Firestorm. Elijah sank to his knees as he read the notification. He'd anticipated that the reward to be good, but the blessing of the dragon exceeded his expectations. The first option was something he'd sought, without any luck for quite some time. The second option was a little less exciting, but the name was evocative enough that he was practically drooling at the possibilities. However, the third choice was probably the most straightforward: a new spell, and the name Firestorm suggested that it was a powerful one. Still, Elijah only looked at the options for a moment before making his decision. You have chosen Core Advancement. Elijah grinned. And then, something exploded inside of him, driving him back into unconsciousness. Elijah awoke suddenly, springing upright the moment awareness returned. However, despite his alarm, he was in no danger. In fact, he felt better than he had ever. Sitting beside the ancestral tree, he glanced down at his hands but saw no difference. One still bore the acid scars he'd gotten in the Sea of Sorrows, while the other, like most of the rest of his body, was riddled with thinner, much lighter scarring from overstepping in his use of Ancestral Circle. It took only a second more for him to realize that he was, once again, completely nude. Sighing, Elijah muttered, "Of course I'm naked. Again." The loss of what amounted to rags wasn't a huge loss, and due to looting the ritualists, his collection of cloth was much deeper than it once had been. However, he really hated sewing, especially since he didn't have proper tools, instead relying on bone hooks and homemade twine in place of thread, so he wasn't looking forward to putting a new outfit together. If only the robes hadn't been sized to fit gnomes, he could have just used them as they were. But that wasn't the case, so it looked like he had a good deal of sewing in his future. For now, though, the day was warm enough that his nudity wasn't terribly uncomfortable. Certainly, he'd have once been a bit self-conscious about it. But there was no one else around aside from Nerthus's inconsistent presence, and after spending so much time in the tower without any clothes, he'd gotten over any shyness he might have once fostered. In any case, he had other things on his mind. Chiefly, the pair of notifications clamoring for his attention. The first was, "Congratulations! You have cultivated a dragon core. Current stage, hatchling." What does that even mean, he said to himself. However, aside from the obvious that he'd managed to reach the first stage of cultivating his core, he had no idea what it meant. Okay, so, tabling that for later, moving on. He pushed past that notification and opened the next. You have reached the first threshold. Current stage, cultivator. Elijah knew that he'd accomplished something important, but he wasn't certain how to categorize it. So, lacking any further information, he opened his status. Name: Elijah Hart. Level: 29. Archetype: Druid. Class: Animist. Specialization: Not applicable. Alignment: Not applicable. Strength: 30. Dexterity: 29. Constitution: 30. Ethera: 38. Regeneration: 32. Attunement: Nature. Cultivation stage, cultivator. Body: Core. Mind: Soul. Wood: Hatchling. Opal: Neophyte. As expected, he'd gained a single point in every attribute when he'd gained level 29. But that certainly didn't account for how much stronger he felt. If he had to compare it to something, he would have likened it to how he'd felt after cultivating his body of wood. Though there was more to it than that, Elijah sensed. So he took a moment to look at his spell book. And at first, it looked no different, at least until he reached Shape of the Predator. Shape of the Predator. Take on the shape of a peerless hunter, vastly increasing your dexterity and strength attributes, and giving an average increase to constitution. Spell casting is suspended while Shape of the Predator is active. There were a couple of changes. First, it had once featured the word mighty to describe the transformation, but now it used the term peerless. Second, it described the increase to his constitution as average instead of minor, suggesting that it would be more impactful. If he'd had any doubts about the general power of his spells, though, they were allayed when he reached his various essence spells, the benefits of which had all doubled. So, instead of Essence of the Monkey increasing his dexterity by 5 points, it now would enhance the attribute by 10 points. Perhaps his other spells would see a similar increase in their potency. But he wanted to check things out, just in case. So, after stopping by the treehouse and wrapping one of the robes around his waist, Elijah headed to the beach, where he usually hunted the giant crabs. Fortunately, there was one there, and even more luckily, the unnatural growth that had transformed the species seemed to have run out of steam. As a result, the one in front of him was no larger than a truck. A good thing, too. When the crabs had continued to grow, he'd spent more than a couple of sleepless nights worrying about world-devouring crabs. Thankfully, it seemed that such a future would remain in his nightmares where such things belonged. In any case, Elijah used his essence spells to increase his regeneration and dexterity, then applied one with nature before pointing his staff at the crab. First, he used entangling roots, and at his command, thick vines erupted from the rocky shore to grab the crab's legs. It tried to tug free, but most of the vines remained intact. And those that broke were quickly replaced by more of the same. That was a marked improvement over the previous incarnation of the spell, which had been weak enough that he'd often forgotten to use it. Now, though, that seemed to have changed, and it was potent enough to at least slow down powerful enemies. Idly, he wondered how it would fare against something like the Voxian monster that had nearly killed the panther. Shaking his head, he knew that such a matchup wouldn't end well. He had no idea how strong either creature had been, but he was well aware of just how poorly he'd match up to either the Vox monster or the guardian panther. He'd gotten stronger, but that kind of power seemed to be out of his reach. For now. Elijah watched as the crab continued to struggle, but it seemed incapable of escape. From experience, though, Elijah knew that it wouldn't last forever. Instead, the spell had a duration of around a minute before it would start to lose steam. So he quickly raised his staff and channeled Storm's fury through it. The bolt of lightning that tore out of the staff of natural harmony was thicker and brighter than any he'd summoned before, and when it hit the crab, it sent bits and pieces of the creature's shell flying away from the point of impact. At the same time, the creature collapsed into a seizure as the powerful electrical current coursed through its body. The aroma of cooking crab filled the air, telling Elijah just how much stronger his spell was. Still, he needed more tests. So he aimed another couple of casts at the crab, killing it. Solid improvement, he muttered to himself. Indeed, the spell had never been the most potent, and before, it had taken at least 8 casts to kill one of the crabs, depending on how strong the individual monsters were. Having that number cut in half was a remarkable increase in power. Still, he had more spells to test. So, over the next few hours, he did just that, finding another crab on the other side of the island, so he could determine how much stronger Swarm had become. Curiously, the afflictions it inflicted weren't that much stronger, but the size of the swarm itself had grown by nearly half. However, the biggest change came when he finally decided to test Shape of the Predator. The transformation occurred much as it always did, but instead of sprouting fur, he grew glistening black scales. Looking down at his claws, he saw that they were far longer as well, and upon seeing that, he quickly sought out a small pool of water so he could look at his reflection. When he did, he let out a reptilian hiss. He certainly didn't look like a panther anymore. Indeed, if he had to describe the new expression of Shape of the Predator, he would have said it was a curious mixture of alligator, wolf, and panther. More than anything, the new form looked like some undiscovered dinosaur, swift, sleek, and more than anything else, deadly. The next big shock came when he used Guise of the Unseen. Instead of simply melting into the shadows as he normally did, he watched his blurry reflection fade away entirely. No, that wasn't necessarily true. He didn't become invisible. Instead, the ability acted more like a chameleon's color-changing defense mechanism, though it was obviously aided by Ethera, because if he stood still, his scales were almost completely indistinguishable from their surroundings. So, not only would he gain far more attributes, but the viability of Guise of the Unseen had seen a significant boost as well. Elijah tracked down another crab, but this time, he only intended to use abilities native to Shape of the Predator. Chiefly, Venom Strike, Predator Strike, and Guise of the Unseen. However, when he pounced, using Predator Strike, his claws went through the animal's shell like it wasn't even there. He destroyed the monster's frontal nerve center with that single attack, and it collapsed in a heap, still alive but incapable of moving anything but its back legs. Silently apologizing for the creature's suffering, he proceeded with checking Venom Strike's viability as well, and he got the results he had expected. The crab died only 30 seconds after Elijah had used Venom Strike, which injected it with a much more potent neurotoxin. He still had one spell to test, but because Calamity had a significant dormant period after being cast, he chose not to experiment. After all, it would be quite an issue if he needed the powerful spell, and didn't have it available. So as he had since acquiring the spell, he kept it in his back pocket, just in case he needed it going forward. Once he'd finished testing his strength, Elijah returned to the grove. There he found Nerthus waiting for him in the tree spirit's customary spot on one of the ancestral tree's branches. "Thanks for bailing on me, Mun," Elijah said. "Do you have any idea how many questions I have? I mean, could you always use the world tree like that? And what happened to you?" Nerthus interrupted. You are different." "Right. Yeah," Elijah said. "Well, the blessing of the dragon, the reward for my task. Well, it gave me 3 options. I could have taken an item called Dragon Wings and..." "You refused." "Dragon Wings are some of the most sought-after items in the universe," Nerthus exclaimed. "They allow for true flight. Do you know how rare that is at your stage?" "Right. Maybe I should have taken that, but I don't think so." The other option was a spell called Firestorm. "I've gotta tell you that one tempted me," he said. "As well it should," Nerthus shouted, clearly excited. "Well, I thought the other option was better," Elijah said. "I upgraded my core." What? How? That should not be possible on this world, the Ethera is too thin." Elijah shrugged. "Don't know what to tell you." "That was the reward," he said. "It's at the hatchling stage, if that means anything to you." "Hatchling? That doesn't, I've never heard of that. What kind of core did you get?" "A nature core." "Tree? Perhaps the predator core." "Dragon." What? "That's what it said on the box," Elijah stated. Then he read the notification aloud. "Congratulations. You have cultivated a dragon core. Current stage, hatchling." Nerthus fell off his tree. Elijah rushed over to make sure the tree spirit was unhurt, but he found the small creature muttering to himself. "That isn't possible. You can't be, no. They wouldn't, but she would have the power to, oh dear." "Calm down, Mun. What's going on? Is a dragon core really that rare?" Elijah asked. Nerthus fixed him with a look of disbelief, then said, "It is beyond rare. As far as I know, it may well be unique." "Oh. Well. That's good, then." "Good? Good? It is unprecedented." "That's what I said. It's good. Maybe I'll be able to get off this island now," Elijah said. His brief trip across the strait had reawakened his need for human companionship. Seeing all those people living normal lives, he wanted something like that. Certainly, he had no intention of abandoning his grove, but he could always return with Ancestral Circle. Anyway, what's so good about it? Oh, yes. Right. Where to begin? How about you start with why you just about have a seizure every time someone says the word dragon, and then we can move on from there. First, you must understand the fundamental races that comprise the universe, Nerthus stated. Humans are one. Obviously. But there are also elves, dwarves, gnomes, goblins, kaiser, and elementals, with each race having various branches. For instance, elves have three main variants: wood elves, dark elves, and high elves. Each of the other races have at least as many varieties, who have followed different evolutionary paths. Okay, Elijah said. When you say races, I'm guessing you're not talking about ethnicity. I am not. Though most races can reproduce with one another, creating even more diversity, each is fundamentally different from the other. Gotcha. Lots of interbreeding. A bunch of half-elves and demi-gnomes running around. Not really my thing, but someone has to be into that kind of thing, right? Elijah asked. Nerthus just looked at him like he'd gone a little crazy. Sorry. This is the second longest conversation we've had, and like I said before, it's kind of gotten to me. Right. Elijah apologized again, then said, carry on. Nerthus continued to explain the shape of the universe and its inhabitants, once again pointing out the difference between devourers and preservers, though Elijah got the feeling that neither group was exactly codified. They were just labels that probably meant different things to different people. He also talked about how there were thousands of worlds, adding, the older they are, the more connected to the world tree they are. That makes the overall Ethera in those worlds thicker, and the denizens more powerful on average. And I'm guessing the world tree is where the system comes from. No. Though it is dependent on the world tree to spread, the system is not of the world tree. Instead, it is the result of multiple transcendents working together, Nerthus answered. They worked for eons until, at last, they created the system. Oh. Why? To help people resist the Vox, of course, Nerthus said. But I digress. You wish to know of dragons. They are what's known as an elder race. There aren't many, and even the youngest among them is capable of feats few of the fundamental races can match. To those of us following a nature path, they are as gods. That certainly explained Nerthus's reaction. Elijah asked, so, what does it mean that I have a dragon core? And why do I feel so much better now? It's like I got 20 or 30% stronger in the blink of an eye. Indeed, during his testing, he'd tested his attributes by lifting progressively heavy rocks, which was where he'd gotten his estimate. It wasn't exactly scientific, but he felt confident in the assessment. You passed the first threshold, said Nerthus. Elijah rolled his eyes. You say that like it's supposed to mean something to me. Come on, man. I have no idea what any of this stuff means, he groaned. It is the system's way of measuring your overall cultivation, he said. There are 9 stages, starting with cultivator and ending with supremacy. It is the first half of godhood. Wait, are you saying I can become a god? Indeed. How do you think the originators gathered enough power to create the system? Of course, they went far beyond our current measurements, but I can become a god, though. Like, you're not screwing with me, are you? Yes. Though I caution you that such a journey will take you millennia. However, with a dragon core, if you progress that far, you will be one of the more powerful deities, Nerthus said. In plain terms, what does core cultivation do? It increases the density and quality of your stored Ethera, making your spells, abilities, and techniques more powerful. Different types of cores represent differing degrees of improvement. For instance, if you were to have cultivated a nature core and reached the seed stage, you would have experienced a 5 or 6% increase in the power of your spells. Higher stages result in larger increases, though I can't speak to anything after the sapling stage. Are you sure about those numbers? Quite. Why do you ask? It's just that, well, I can't say that this is the case for everything, but my essence spells, they increase my attributes by set amounts, all experienced a bigger increase than what you're describing. Oh? That should be expected with a dragon core. They are some of the most powerful beings in the universe after all. How large of an increase did those abilities experience? 10%? 15? Higher. A lot higher. 30? Elijah gestured for the tree spirit to keep going. Nerthus went pale, quite a feat, considering that he was made of tree bark, and Elijah took pity on him. He said, double. D-double. Yeah. For those spells, at least. I can't tell for sure with the others, though. That isn't possible. You've said that a couple of times already. I don't think you really know what that word means. Nerthus looked like he was on the verge of having a seizure, so Elijah changed the subject. So, you said dragons are only one of the elder races, right? What are the other ones? Nerthus shook his head, muttering to himself, but after a few seconds, he looked up and answered, demons are one. Angels are another. And mechaniques, though they are exceedingly rare. Demons? Elijah said. Then, he held his hands up to his head with his index fingers pointing skyward. Like horns, forked tails, and cloven hooves. Indeed, Nerthus answered. They are the sworn enemies of angels, though they rarely come into actual conflict. Long ago, they reached an agreement to remain on their respective sides of the universe. If they hadn't, there's every chance that nothing would have survived the ensuing war. Mechaniques, by comparison, are a race of awakened golems. No one knows how they reached that stage, and any attempts to replicate the feat have met with failure. There are a handful of other elder races that have died out as well. That's a lot to take in. The idea that angels and demons were real had been more of a surprise than seeing gnomes and dwarves. So, is there a reason why some of our religious stories and myths mention these elder races? Or the foundational races, come to that? Before the planet's integration, it would have been incredibly difficult for them to reach your planet. However, difficult does not mean impossible. Likely, this planet has been visited sometime in the past, which is the source of your myths, legends, and religions. Elijah shook his head. If the rest of the world knew that, then there were probably some religions that would experience quite a bit of upheaval. The only thing that made it any more palatable was that the way Nerthus described deities was more like Greek gods, rather than any of the omnipotent monotheistic versions. The first was frightening, but the second was far more so. The idea that a flawed being could reach that level of power was one of the most horrifying things Elijah could imagine. What does this mean for me, though? He asked. Druids are already rare, Nerthus said. But a druid with a dragon core. If there is another one in the entire universe, I would be shocked. You must keep this to yourself. Otherwise, the grove will be in danger. Why? Some will see it as an obstacle to overcome, Nerthus said. Strength invites challenge. However, dragons have their own enemies. We have spoken of this, but you must understand that the most extreme devourers can, and will attempt to harvest anything they can find that will increase their power. That was why the young dragon was trapped. That is why you must be careful. Even if only your core is of the dragon, it is still valuable in the extreme. Elijah sighed. Understood, he said, thinking that it sounded like more trouble than it was worth. However, he only needed to remember the challenges he'd faced so far to recognize the necessity to gather as much strength as he could. That included his dragon core, regardless of the problems that came with it. All right, I only have a couple more questions, Elijah said. Indeed, he'd been compiling them since the very beginning, and now that Nerthus was willing to explain some things, he intended to take full advantage. You've mentioned that the World Tree let you connect with Sarah's mother. How? The World Tree connects everything. You merely need to know how to tap into it. Your spell, Ancestral Circle, does this. I really don't understand. You don't need to, Nerthus said. And I haven't the time to explain it in the sort of depth understanding would require. All right. No need to get snippy, Elijah said. And I see you're getting a bit antsy to get back in your tree, so I've only got one more question. Nerthus sighed, very well. Why aren't we being inundated by powerful beings? Elijah asked. Those gnomes had some strength, but the fact that, after less than 2 years, I could kill them like that suggests that they weren't very powerful. But that doesn't make sense. How come there aren't stronger people here taking over the world? 2 reasons. First, there's no reason to, Nerthus stated. This world may one day be valuable, but for now, getting here and taking over is far more trouble than it's worth. That may change in the future, but for now, only the people who want to escape their old lives would come here. Second, the low density of ambient Ethera is uncomfortable for anyone above a certain level or cultivation threshold. What about Sarah? How was she trapped? She is a child and, according to her mother, she was reckless. For someone with the right skills, that is all that's necessary. Let that be a lesson to you, protector of the grove. No matter how strong you become, a moment of inattention is all it will take to bring you low. That's a cheery thought. You must excuse me, Nerthus said. I have stayed far longer than I should. If the Ethera levels continue to rise, I should soon be capable of leaving the tree permanently. However, I should point out that I will never be able to leave the grove. Oh. That sucks. Nerthus cocked his head to the side, then said, No. Not really. This is a great thing, tending a druid's grove. At heart, I am still a tree, and trees were never meant to roam. Goodbye for now. Yeah. See you later, Nerthus. With that, the tree spirit retreated to the ancestral tree, laid his hand on the trunk, and then merged with it. The process was a bit of a mind-bender, but Elijah had seen it often enough that it didn't really seem that odd to him anymore. What a weird world. After that, Elijah stood, grabbed the pack that had been discarded when he'd returned to the grove, and headed back to his tree house, where he intended to get started on sewing his new clothing. Halfway up the stairs, he stopped mid-step as he felt something he had hoped he would never feel. Someone had landed on his island. No. Not just one person. A veritable army of gnomes, goblins, and dwarves had invaded his domain. He could feel them all so thoroughly that it almost felt like he was standing right there beside them. 10. 20. 30. The numbers didn't stop climbing until he reached 50, all having been carried ashore by a small fleet of rowboats. Elijah was vaguely aware that one of them was shouting orders, but his domain didn't extend to interpretation of sound. It didn't matter, though. Even as they spread out, he hopped down the steps and checked his enhancements. They were all still active. With that confirmed, he was ready to defend his domain, and he quickly shifted into the shape of the predator. Once he'd taken on his new form, he set off across the island he knew so well. Elijah darted through the dark forest like a ghost, letting guys of the unseen hide him. The ability didn't just change the color of his scales, or use the shadows to obscure him. Instead, it also harnessed his Ethera to muffle every other aspect of his presence. He was quieter. His odor less pronounced. Even the air moved a little less while he was cloaked in the ability. Still, it wasn't perfect, and at the speed he dashed beneath the trees, he knew he was vaguely visible. Fortunately, the awareness that came with his domain helped him avoid anything, whether it was wild animals or his prey, so he remained as unseen as the name of his ability would suggest. 50 invaders was a daunting number. In the ritual chamber, he'd fought against 6, and he'd only narrowly managed to survive. And who knew if these newcomers would be more suited to a fight? After all, he hadn't forgotten the battle that had killed the panther. That trio of combatants had been far stronger than the ritualists. So Elijah knew he needed to be prepared for the worst. Both shape of the predator and essence of the monkey provided double their previous attribute enhancements, and one with nature probably did so as well, even if it wasn't displayed in his status. So his effective dexterity and strength had more than doubled with the formation of his dragon core. And that wasn't even considering the even more ephemeral increase he'd gotten from passing the first threshold. No, he was more powerful than ever before. The only problem was that he expected that he would need it if he was going to repel the invasion. 1 against 50 weren't good odds, no matter how much stronger he felt. Even with his advantages, if he made one small mistake, he would become easy prey. So, knowing how close to the edge he needed to walk, he let himself slip into the instincts that had come with shape of the predator. They'd let him survive the primordial forest, so Elijah reasoned that they would stand him in good stead against the invaders. Hopefully, he would retain enough of his rational mind to pull out of it once everything was done. With that done, his gait became even more graceful, his movements more silent as the animalistic part of his mind took full advantage of his improved attributes. He never slowed, springing over natural gullies, bounding past boulders, and climbing and leaping from tree to tree when there was no other option. He covered almost 3 miles in a little more than a quarter of an hour, a mighty feat, considering the terrain, and during that time, few of the island's residents even knew of his passing. It was a heady feeling, knowing just how efficient a predator he had become. But soon, he pushed those emotions to the side as he finally reached his destination. The beach was one of the more accessible on the island, with a long, open stretch of shore marred only by the occasional rock or piece of driftwood. There were a dozen boats, each a copy of the one Elijah had used to cross the strait. With a clear night sky lit by a carpet of stars as well as the silvery light of a gibbous moon, there was plenty of illumination for him to study his prey. Most of them were diminutive gnomes, but there were a few green-skinned goblins and broad-shouldered dwarves mixed in as well. More importantly, they were kitted out for battle, with most of them wearing one sort of armor or another. Elijah saw more than a few wearing sturdy plate, while most wore chainmail mixed with hardened leather. Even the ones Elijah marked as casters wore armored robes and carried staves. The rest were armed with a wide variety of weapons ranging from axes to swords and shields, with quite a few wielding bows mixed in. They didn't look so much like the small army he'd expected, as they seemed to be a collection of individuals. Elijah could only hope he would be able to use that to his advantage. So he watched from the tree line, keeping low to the ground with guise of the unseen masking his presence. And as they started setting up tents a few dozen yards from shore, far enough to keep dry during high tide, but not nearly enough for Elijah's preference, an idea began to take shape. And the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. So once Elijah was satisfied with his plan, he set off back the way he'd come. As he did, he kept a proverbial eye on the invaders via the senses granted by his domain, but they continued setting up their camp. When they'd first arrived, Elijah had thought they had somehow followed the metaphysical trail he'd left behind after rescuing Sarah. However, the fact that they seemed keen on sticking around for at least a little while suggested a different motivation, though Elijah wasn't clear on what precisely that was. Sure, he felt confident that it had something to do with the ancestral tree, but beyond that he was completely ignorant. In any case, he didn't expect he would ever find out. With any luck, he'd be rid of them in only a few hours. With that in mind, he continued to dash through the woods until, at last, he reached a familiar beach on the other side of the island. Fortunately, he only had to follow the beach for a few minutes in order to find his quarry. One of the huge crabs stood before him, busy tearing into some carcass that had washed ashore. Elijah wasted no time before bounding toward the creature, then tapping it on its leg. Then, as the monster skittered around, he sprang backward out of range of its claws. Then he took off down the beach, the crab in tow. Every now and then, when the crustacean started to lose interest in the chase, he'd circle around and re-engage. Even before reaching the first threshold and having his spells and abilities enhanced by the dragon core, he'd been capable of running circles around the crabs. He could even manage it in his human form, so doing it as the scaled predator barely required any focus. Elijah led the creature along the beach until he saw another crab. When he did, he repeated the process, nipping at its armored legs before dashing along. It followed, just like the other, though it was about 30 feet in front of the first. He kept going, leading the creatures along as he gradually circled the island. It took hours, but the only really tricky part had come when he reached the western cliffs. There he'd had to switch to his human form and swim while keeping the crabs engaged via Storm's fury. He lost one along the way, but by that point, he'd grabbed 3 others, and he reached the next beach without any further issue. As soon as his Ethera allowed, he switched back to the predator form, and continued along until he felt the invaders' camp looming ahead of him. Throughout the process, Elijah had let his mind wander slightly. However, with the invaders so close, he re-engaged his focus and stalked forward. He knew he had to time things correctly. Otherwise, the crabs would lose interest. By that point, the invaders had finished setting up their camp, and they'd set out a few sentries, one of which was only a couple dozen feet in front of him. The scout wore stiff leather armor and was armed with a bow, but more importantly, he was clearly alert. It didn't help. Elijah circled, staying low and hidden by the terrain, until he saw the gnome's back. Then, using Predator Strike, he pounced. The first attack met little resistance, but it wasn't immediately fatal. He let out a high-pitched scream, but was quickly silenced by a claw to the throat. Without skipping a beat and knowing just how tight his window was, Elijah clamped his jaws around the scout's thin arm, bit through the bone, then repeated the option on the other limbs. In short order, he had 5 pieces of gnome piled before him. More troublingly, the crabs were almost upon him, and the gnome's scream had roused the camp. That was fine, though. Elijah shifted back to his human form, grabbed one of the limbs, and tossed it in the direction of the skittering crabs. Then, he repeated the action, scattering the bloody chunks of gnome in a rough line that led directly to the camp. After that was done, he ran off, bounding across the rocky shore and into the tree line. No one had ever seen him. His breath coming shallow and fast, Elijah circled the camp. Even in his human form, he was no slouch when it came to remaining hidden, and soon enough, he found himself on the other side of the camp. It was at that moment that the crabs came into view, having followed Elijah's trail of gnome parts. When the invaders saw the massive monsters, they let loose with a wide variety of attacks. Mages cast fireballs, archers shot arrows, and the heavily armored warriors rushed to what they thought were the front lines. That left the other scouts on a proverbial island where, even if they shouted an alarm, they would get little support. And Elijah was more than willing to take advantage of that. In his caster form, he wasn't nearly as deadly as he would be as the scaled predator, but he was still much stronger than an average human. And he had a big, sturdy stick. So when he rushed the gnome, swinging his staff like a baseball bat, the little scout fell without a word. He hadn't died, he'd only been knocked unconscious, but that was fine. Elijah had no qualms about finishing the job with the knife at his belt. After slitting the invader's throat, he took a look back at the camp. They were handling the crabs well enough, and though the crustaceans had little hope of actually hurting the invaders, they were extremely durable. And there were almost a dozen of them, which meant that the camp's damage was spread out enough that it gave Elijah plenty of time to kill the lone remaining scout. This one went much the same as the last, though it took 2 staff strikes to put the goblin down. Still, Elijah managed, then slit the green-skinned creature's throat before turning back to the camp. 3 of the crabs had been killed, and the rest were on their last legs. Not surprising, considering the overwhelming strength of the force. However, Elijah had never meant for the crabs to be anything but a distraction. His real attack was forthcoming. He only wished he'd had the chance to test it, but between the rescue, his subsequent recovery, and gaining his dragon core, it had slipped his mind. In his defense, his island had been relatively safe since the very beginning, so he hadn't expected a small army of invaders to land on his shores. Still, as he gathered his Ethera, he vowed to never let it happen again. From now on, he'd test his abilities and spells as soon as he could. Once he'd shifted enough Ethera into the appropriate spell, he cast Calamity, hoping it would be just as devastating as the description implied. Mist swirled around Alyssa as the monster launched itself at her. Moving far more quickly than any normal human could have managed, she raised her spear of the dragon lancer just in time to intercept its snapping jaws. Still, its momentum hit her like a truck, sending her tumbling onto her back. The monster followed, raking its claws across her breastplate. The metal held but only barely, and Alyssa used the creature's inertia against it as she rolled, kicking up as she sent it flying past her. It hit a nearby wall, shattering glass and distorting the steel frame of a floor-to-ceiling window. Even as it skidded across the building's lobby, an arrow followed. Just before it hit, the projectile split into 3, each of which slammed into its chest. A stream of pale blood arced into the air as the monster screamed. A blur materialized behind it, and suddenly, its head was rolling to a stop at Trace's feet. The outlaw disappeared a second later, but Alyssa didn't see it. Instead, she was too busy pushing herself to her feet, so she could face the next threat. There were 3 enemies, each advancing with cautious implacability. They looked much the same as all the other monsters they'd faced in the city: pale white skin, with almost human features and abnormally muscular bodies, but Alyssa wasn't concerned with their appearance. She had already seen enough of them, after all. Stomping down, she used Shockwave, the ability sending out a wave of force that briefly stunned them. Then, she thrust her spear forward in a move that might have looked odd from a full 15 feet away. As she lunged, she used Unstoppable Thrust, sending a thick wave of ethereal force piercing through them. Unstoppable Thrust. Thrust with a spear or lance, hitting all enemies in a straight line. It wasn't enough to kill the monsters, but it certainly did plenty of damage. More importantly, it kept them off balance as she used Heroic Leap, pushing herself high into the air. Then, she fell upon them with Descending Dragon, skewering the centermost monster with her spear. Even as the blade exploded through its skull, she let loose with Champion's Shout, striking fear into the remaining creatures. It wouldn't last long. She knew that. But then again, she didn't need much time to wrench her spear free and sweep it out in a wide arc that hacked into the second monster's neck. She used that momentum to sweep the legs out from under the third monster, which she dispatched with a 2-handed thrust to its inhuman face. But that's where her luck ran out. Something rammed into her back, sending her sprawling across the concrete sidewalk. The metal of her armor screeched in protest as she tried to twist around, but her assailant had timed its attack well. Without looking back, she used Bulwark, hoping to superimpose the invisible shield between herself and her attacker. But without being able to see, her aim was off, and she placed the shield behind the pale-skinned monster. So she improvised, gathering her limbs beneath her and pushing up with all her might. As she did, she once again activated Heroic Leap. Bones crunched hers as well as the monster's, but she gritted her teeth through the pain and sent an elbow back to hit the monster again. It let loose with what sounded like a combination of a dog's yelp and a human scream, but it didn't loosen its grip. If anything, it clung to her back with even more fervor, its claws digging deep into her flesh. Then, heat washed over her, and the monster's screams ceased. "Stay still," yelled Bryce. Then, Alyssa screamed as something ripped the claws free. Bryce called out, "Need a heal." "I'm almost out of Ethera," responded Varen. But despite the healer's lack of fuel, a spell of regeneration washed over Alyssa. The wounds in her back closed, though she knew that a single spell wouldn't entirely heal the damage. In fact, if she moved too violently, the lacerations would reopen. Still, it was better than nothing. She used Recover, sending her regeneration through the roof. With that done, she levered herself to her feet. Wobbling, Alyssa thrust the butt of her staff into the ground and looked around. The monsters were dead, and everyone had survived. For now. She'd lost track of how long they'd been there. Time was difficult to track in the mist, and even without it, there was no night or day to mark the time. Still, she suspected it had been days, at least. Maybe as much as a week, based on how often they'd been forced to rest, and barely an hour of it had passed without significant combat. But according to Trace, they'd finally reached their destination. More importantly, they'd done so without losing anyone else. Sure, they'd all been injured, but they'd made it. Letting out a deep sigh to steady her nerves and help herself deal with the pain of her persistent wounds, Alyssa looked around. Everyone was there, and aside from Roman, they were all looking to her for direction. She said, "Into the building. Find us a defensible position. But the capital is right there." She glared at Trace. The man's armor had definitely seen better days, but due to Varen's ministrations, he was whole. The same could be said for all the others. For her part, Alyssa's armor was mostly intact, though she'd lost one of her vambraces during a previous fight. Still, for her next suit of armor, Alyssa intended to ask Carmen to make her a more robust backplate. The current level of protection back there was woefully insufficient, as she'd discovered when the latest monster had sunk its claws into her back. Aside from the terrible state of their armor, everyone looked exhausted. And given what had happened the last time they'd gone from one level of the tower to another, which was what she assumed would happen when they reached the capital, Alyssa wanted everyone in the best shape possible. That meant rest and repast. No one spoke much over the next couple of hours. By that point, they didn't have much to say. For her part, Alyssa watched for any sign of attack, planting herself in the doorway as the rest of her team prepared for what was to come. She was so focused on the lobby of the building, which looked like every upscale office building she'd ever seen, that she didn't even notice Roman until he put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, moving with incredible speed as she extricated herself from his grip. She had her spear up and at his neck in only an instant. The moment she realized what she'd done, she retracted the blade and apologized. Roman shook his head, saying, "No need to apologize. We're all on edge. I shouldn't have snuck up on you." Alyssa sighed, then resumed her vigil. Roman joined her. "What do you think we'll find on the next level?" she asked at last. "More monsters," he stated. "Beyond that, I don't know. But I don't think we're done with this one." "Really?" she asked. "You read the guides. There's probably some kind of guardian boss monster," supplied Bryce from across the room. She turned her head and glared at him. "Don't eavesdrop." "Sorry, boss." "Right," Roman said, running his hand through his hair. "There's probably something we'll have to beat before we advance. Maybe it's another horde of monsters. Or it might be a bigger, badder monster. But I don't think we're done with this level. Not by a long shot." Alyssa didn't know how to respond to that. She was already prepared for something worse, so it didn't really matter if they met it at the end of the second level or the beginning of the third. So she just said, "We'll beat whatever we find. We don't have a choice." Roman didn't say anything after that, instead giving Alyssa's shoulder another squeeze before heading back to rest with the others. At one point, he might have tried to relieve her, but he'd learned firsthand that doing so wouldn't do any good. She had a responsibility, and with her heavy armor, recoverability, and high level, she was the best person for the job. So if someone wanted to replace her as the group's guardian, they'd have to physically drag her out of the way. No one was willing to try that. After a couple more hours, Alyssa's wounds had healed, and everyone had recovered enough that they felt confident in moving forward. So they set off from the skyscraper's lobby and down the wide street. The evidence of the previous battle remained, but they all ignored it. Instead, they kept moving along the route defined by Trace's scouting, and soon enough, the capital came into view. "Familiar," she muttered. And it was. The building before them lay at the center of a wide plaza whose details were lost to the mist. However, the building itself was almost a perfect replica of the U.S. Capitol building, though even larger than the real thing. Still, Alyssa was less concerned with that than the creature planted at the base of the steps. "Eyes up," she said a little louder, hefting her spear. "Boss monster ahead." The monster in question looked a lot like the others they'd fought, though where they were roughly human-sized, this new creature was the size of a giant. If it was less than 15 feet tall, Alyssa would have been surprised, and its frame bulged with dense muscle. More, the pale skin was riddled with raised green veins. And what's even worse, it had clearly noticed them because it pushed itself to its feet, an act which made Alyssa reassess her previous estimate of the thing's height. It was at least 20 feet tall, and maybe even larger. A shiver of fear slid up Alyssa's spine, but she suppressed it. You all know what to do. Indeed, the group had been working together for long enough that they were all extremely familiar with the most effective strategy. Alyssa stepped forward. The monster echoed the motion, cocking its head to the side as if surprised that she wasn't running in fear. She hefted her spear in both hands. Then, she used Heart of the Dragon, flooding her body with Ethera, and inflating her physical attributes. Meanwhile, Roman stepped to the side, raising his bow. He drew an arrow from the quiver at his waist, but he didn't draw it back. Not yet. At the same time, Bryce started casting a spell while Trace slipped away unnoticed, fading into the mist. Finally, Varen slipped her morning star from her waist and cast her own spell. Alyssa felt the woman's heal over time spell hit her, followed by a second effect. Thus prepared, she trotted forward. The monster was only 40 yards away, so it wasn't long before Alyssa used heroic leap, following it up with descending dragon. Predictably, the monster was taken by surprise. Even if it had expected her descent, it certainly didn't envision the sheer ferocity of her first strike. Still, it managed to dodge to the side at the last second, so Alyssa's spear, which had been aimed at its head, hit its meaty shoulder instead. The blade tore through pale flesh, spraying Alyssa with a fountain of blood. She bounded backwards, leaving the spear embedded in the monster. She might have been capable of dislodging it, but she wasn't sure of it. So she'd chosen not to try. Flipping, she used her newest ability. Leathery wings manifested, spreading out from her shoulder blades and allowing her to glide away. It was perfectly timed too, because only a second later, the monster charged forward, trampling the spot where she would have landed. Instead, it caught nothing but air, and Alyssa cancelled the ability. She landed on its shoulders, grabbed the spear, and used Enrage. With her increased strength, she yanked it free, then used heroic leap to send herself flying away. Predictably, the monster attempted to follow, but she'd used bulwark the moment her feet left its bulbous flesh. So it hit the low wall, tipped over, and landed on its face. That's when Bryce finished his spell. The ground beneath the monster erupted, and suddenly the earthworm wrapped itself around its torso. The creature screamed in pain as the worm squeezed, its rocky flesh contracting until bones started to break. But it didn't last long before, with a mighty shove, the monster broke free. Rocks and earth exploded in every direction as a roar of fury filled the air. Before it could rise, Roman shot it. Once. Twice. Thrice, the thwop of his bowstring sounded, and suddenly, 3 arrows sprouted from the monster. It seemed stunned, looking down at them in confusion. They had barely even pierced its skin, much less done any damage. Then they exploded into whirlwinds of shadow that enveloped the thing. Another arrow hit its leg, and arcane black chains shackled it to the ground. Another arrow took it in the head, piercing one of its eyes. It stumbled, clearly blinded by Roman's newest ability. He hadn't named it, but Alyssa thought of it as blinding shot. He'd kept the rest of his ability names a secret as well, but they were certainly effective at hindering the creature. Still, Roman didn't have the ability to finish it off. And Bryce had only just begun casting his latest spell. Fortunately, that was when Trace made himself known. He launched himself from the mist as if he'd only just manifested from nothing. His swords flashed as he fell on the creature, stabbing down into its chest. Then, he raced away, disappearing back into the mist. The blinded monster never even knew he was there. But it wasn't dead. Like Roman, Trace kept his ability names close to his chest. However, Alyssa had seen the outlaw's blades rip through lesser creatures with ease, so she knew just how much damage he could do. The monster had to be on its last legs. Alyssa just needed to finish it off. So she strode forward, and when she reached the hobbled creature, she used Unstoppable Thrust. A wave of piercing force ripped through it, sending more blood to spray across the plaza. Then, she used Heroic Leap, sailing high into the air. When she started to fall, she summoned an invisible bulwark before kicking off the plane of Ethera with yet another Heroic Leap. Twice more she repeated the action until she was more than 100 feet in the air. Then, at last, she used Descending Dragon. Descending Dragon. Fall upon an enemy, dealing more damage based on distance fallen. Protected from falling damage while ability is active. She fell, leading the way with her spear. Just before she reached the monster, its eyes cleared, and for the briefest of moments, it saw its doom. The spear of the dragon lancer bit into the monster's skull with enough force to shatter it entirely. But Alyssa's attack didn't end there. Instead, her knee took it in the chest, obliterating flesh and bone alike before cracking the plaza's stone tiles and digging a shallow crater in the ground below. When the dust settled, she rose, covered in the creature's blood and having defeated the guardian of the tower's second level. Without any of them, it wouldn't have been possible. Roman had hobbled it. Both Bryce and Trace had weakened it so that Alyssa could finish it off. It was a team effort, but to anyone who saw her rising from that crater, it was clear who'd shouldered the bulk of the load. Alyssa looked around, then down at her gore-covered body before letting out a resigned sigh. I really need a shower.